Arizona Territory, 1868. The sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape as Henry Everett squinted into the distance, tracking the herd of wild mustangs that roamed the vast frontier. His 25 years of life had taught him one brutal lesson: the West was no place for sentiment. Men who allowed themselves to feel too deeply ended up dead, their bones bleaching under the merciless sun. The Apache Wars had ravaged the territory for years, and though treaties were in place, tension hung in the air like the promise of thunder before a storm. Henry had seen enough bloodshed to last several lifetimes. As a ranch hand who had traveled from Texas after losing his family in the war between the states, he'd built walls around himself as solid as any frontier fort. "A man stands alone out here," he muttered to his horse, a dun-colored gelding that had been his only companion for the past 3 years. "That's how you survive." Henry worked for the Diamond B Ranch, breaking horses and driving cattle through terrain that seemed designed by nature to kill the unprepared. His boss, Bernard Michaels, valued Henry's quiet competence and unerring sense of direction. What Bernard didn't know was that Henry lived by one unbreakable rule: never get attached, not to people, not to places. Because attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. He'd learned that when Confederate raiders had burned his family's small Texas farm to the ground, leaving him orphaned at 18. The memory of his mother's screams still haunted his dreams. Yet despite his determination to remain disconnected, Henry couldn't deny the emptiness that gnawed at him each night as he stared up at the star-filled sky. Something was missing, something he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge. His reverie was broken by the distant sound of gunshots. Henry tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. The shots came again, 3 in quick succession, not hunters. A signal, or worse, trouble. He spurred his horse toward the sound, cresting a small ridge to see a scene that would change the course of his carefully ordered life forever. Below, a small wagon was surrounded by 4 rough-looking men, clearly outlaws. A lone figure, a woman, had taken cover behind the wagon, a rifle in her hands. Even from this distance, Henry could see she was Apache. Henry hesitated. This wasn't his fight. Getting involved meant risking everything: his life, his job, his sacred detachment. The smart play was to ride away, to pretend he'd never seen this, but something held him there. Perhaps it was the woman's fearless stance, or maybe the overwhelming odds she faced. Whatever the reason, Henry found himself drawing his revolver and urging his horse down the slope. "4 against 1 doesn't seem sporting, gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the desert. The outlaws whirled, weapons raised. Henry kept riding, weaving his horse in an unpredictable pattern that made him a difficult target. He fired twice, forcing the men to scatter for cover. "This ain't your business, cowboy," one shouted. "I'm making it my business," Henry replied, circling around to position himself between the attackers and the woman. What happened next was a blur of gunfire and dust. Henry managed to wing one of the outlaws, while the woman's precise shots dropped another. Facing deteriorating odds, the remaining 2 men retreated, dragging their wounded companion. Only when the danger had passed did Henry turn to look properly at the woman he'd helped. She stood tall and proud, her rifle still at the ready, dark eyes assessing him with intelligence and caution. She was young, perhaps 20, with long black hair arranged in 2 braids. Her dress was a mixture of traditional Apache and frontier styles, a practical calico skirt paired with beaded moccasins and a leather vest over a simple blouse. Despite the dust of battle, her beauty was striking, with high cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw. "I didn't need your help," she said in perfect, unaccented English. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Look to me like you did. I had a plan." Was getting killed part of that plan? He dismounted, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. She finally lowered her rifle. "My name is Cholla Hawkins." The name caught Henry by surprise. "Hawkins. My father was a trader, my mother is Apache from the Chiricahua band." Her gaze was direct, challenging. "Does that bother you, cowboy?" Henry shrugged. "None of my concern." "Name's Henry Everett." He glanced at her wagon, noting the broken wheel. "You're not going anywhere on that." "I noticed," Cholla said dryly. "Those men were after my father's maps. He was a surveyor as well as a trader." "And where is your father now?" A shadow passed over her face. dead 2 winters ago, influenza. Henry nodded, understanding loss all too well. And your mother? With our people. I was educated at the mission school. I live between worlds, she gestured at the wagon. I was bringing supplies to my mother's people when those men attacked. Henry knew he should ride away. Getting involved with this woman's problems meant commitment, connection, everything he avoided. But the broken wagon wheel presented a problem he couldn't ignore. Night would fall soon, and leaving a woman alone in the territory was a death sentence. My ranch is about 10 miles south, he said finally. We can hitch your horse to mine, bring what you can carry, and I'll send men back for your wagon tomorrow. Cholla studied him for a long moment. Why would you help me? It was a good question, one Henry couldn't fully answer. Let's just say I don't like those odds either, 4 against 1. 5 against 1, she corrected. You're forgetting yourself. Despite himself, Henry felt the corner of his mouth twitch. I reckon you're right about that. As they secured her essential belongings and prepared to ride double on Henry's horse, neither could have predicted how this chance encounter would challenge everything Henry believed about survival on the frontier, or how Cholla would teach him that the very connections he feared might be his salvation. The ride to Diamond B Ranch was tense with unspoken questions. Cholla sat behind Henry, maintaining a proper distance despite the necessity of sharing his horse. Her presence, the light pressure of her hands at his waist, the subtle scent of sage and pine that clung to her, unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. Your boss won't mind you bringing an Apache woman to his ranch? Cholla asked, breaking the silence. Bernard's a fair man. He judges people by their actions, not their blood. You sound certain. I am. Henry guided his horse around a patch of Cholla cactus, a namesake that didn't escape his notice. He hired me when no one else would, a Confederate orphan with nothing but the clothes on his back. You fought for the South. No, I was too young, but where I'm from, that distinction didn't matter much after the war. They crested a rise and the Diamond B spread before them, a collection of buildings nestled in a protected valley, with corrals full of horses and cattle grazing on the surrounding grassland. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but it was well established and prosperous. Bernard Michaels emerged from the main house as they rode in, his weathered face registering surprise at the sight of Henry's companion. Trouble, Henry? He called. Henry dismounted and helped Cholla down, then explained the situation in terse, efficient sentences. Bernard listened, his expression thoughtful. You did right, he said finally. Miss Hawkins, you're welcome to stay the night. My wife will be glad for female company. He turned to Henry. Take Simmons and Jackson tomorrow to retrieve the wagon. That night, after a surprisingly comfortable dinner during which Mrs. Michaels fussed over Cholla with maternal affection, Henry found himself unable to sleep. He left the bunkhouse and walked to the corral, where the moonlight silvered the backs of the horses. Your boss is unusual, Cholla's voice came from the shadows. She stepped forward, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the desert night's chill. Shouldn't you be resting? Henry asked, uncomfortable with her presence yet somehow drawn to it. I'm not used to sleeping indoors, she joined him at the fence. Thank you for today. Henry nodded, unsure how to respond. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the horses. Why do you do it? She asked suddenly. Do what? Keep everyone at a distance. Mrs. Michaels says you've been here 3 years but know nothing about the other hands, share nothing of yourself. Henry stiffened. Mrs. Michaels talks too much. She cares about you. They all do. Cholla turned to face him. You're part of something here whether you want to be or not. Is that so? Henry's voice took on an edge. And what exactly do you know about me? I know loss when I see it, she said simply. I know what it looks like when someone decides the price of caring is too high. Her words struck too close to home. You should get some rest, he said, pushing away from the fence. We head out at first light. As he walked away, Henry felt her eyes on him, seeing too much, understanding too deeply. It left him unsettled, as if she had reached through the carefully constructed walls of his isolation and touched something he'd thought long buried. The next morning, Henry, along with 2 other ranch hands, rode out to retrieve Cholla's wagon. They found it undisturbed, made the necessary repairs, and by mid-afternoon were heading back to the ranch. So what's her story? Simmons asked, a red-headed man with an easy smile. the Apache girl. She's half Apache, Henry corrected, and it's not our business. Just asking, Simmons said, raising his hands in surrender. Not every day we get a visitor like her. Henry remained silent, uncomfortable with the conversation. But Simmons' question lingered. What was Cholla's story? She'd mentioned her father's death and her mother's return to her people, but there was clearly more to the young woman who moved so confidently between worlds. When they returned to the ranch, Henry found Cholla in the kitchen with Mrs. Michaels, helping prepare dinner. The domesticity of the scene jarred with his image of the fierce woman he'd seen defending herself against outlaws. She looked up as he entered, a smile transforming her serious face. "The wagon," she asked. "Fixed and waiting," Henry replied. "You can leave tomorrow." Something like disappointment flickered across her features, but she nodded. "Thank you." That evening, as they gathered around the table, Bernard asked Cholla about her destination. "I'm taking supplies to my mother's people," she explained. "Medicine, cloth, tools. Things they can't get because the reservation supplies are stolen before they arrive." "Dangerous journey for a woman alone," Bernard observed. "I've made it before," Cholla said, "though I usually avoid the main trails." "Those men must have been watching the trading post." "What men?" Mrs. Michaels asked, alarmed. Henry explained about the outlaws, downplaying the danger but emphasizing Cholla's courage. As he spoke, he realized he was defending her, admiring her, feelings he hadn't allowed himself in years. "You'll need protection," Bernard said decisively. "Henry will escort you." Henry froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Sir, you're the best man I have with a gun and you know the territory. It's not a request, son." Henry wanted to refuse, to explain why getting further involved was a terrible idea. But the authority in Bernard's voice and the expectation in the faces around the table made that impossible. He nodded once, curtly. "We'll leave at first light," he told Cholla, avoiding her eyes. That night, for the first time in years, Henry dreamed not of his family's deaths but of dark eyes and a voice that seemed to see straight through him. The journey began in tense silence. Henry rode slightly ahead, scanning the terrain for signs of danger while Cholla followed with the wagon. The supplies she carried were valuable: blankets, medicine, tools that would help her mother's band survive the coming months. By mid-morning, the silence had become oppressive. Cholla urged her horse forward until she rode alongside Henry. "You didn't want to come," she stated. Henry adjusted his hat against the sun. "Doesn't matter what I want." Bernard gave an order. "You could have refused." "Not how it works." Cholla studied him. "What happened to make you so afraid of connection?" Henry's head snapped toward her. "I'm not afraid." "Aren't you? You build walls so high no one can climb them. You keep moving so no one can find you. That's fear, Henry Everett." Anger flared in his chest. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're running. I just don't know what from." She guided her horse back to the wagon, leaving Henry with thoughts he couldn't silence. They made camp that evening near a small stream, the Chiricahua Mountains looming in the distance. As Henry built a fire, Cholla unpacked provisions. "We'll reach my mother's camp tomorrow afternoon," she said. "They've moved into the high country for summer." Henry nodded, focused on his task. The fire crackled to life, casting dancing shadows across their small camp. "You never answered my question," Cholla said after they had eaten, "about what you're running from." Henry stared into the flames. "What makes you think I'll answer now?" "Because there's something between us," she said simply. "Something neither of us expected." The directness of her statement startled him. He looked up to find her watching him, her expression open and unguarded. For a moment, Henry considered deflecting, changing the subject, maintaining the distance he'd cultivated for so long. Instead, he found himself speaking. "My family had a small farm in East Texas. During the war, raiders came, not soldiers, just men taking advantage of the chaos. They burned everything, killed my parents and sister while I watched, hidden in the root cellar." He paused, the memory still raw despite the passing years. "I was 18, old enough to fight back, but I froze, couldn't move. Just listen to them die." Cholla's expression softened with understanding, not pity. "So you punish yourself by refusing to care for anyone again." "It's not punishment, it's protection," Henry poked at the fire. People die out here all the time. Disease, accidents, violence. Getting attached just means more pain when they're gone. And what kind of life is that? Cholla moved to sit beside him, empty, hollow. My people believe that connection is what gives life meaning. Family, community, the land itself. Without those bonds, we are nothing. Your people also know about loss, Henry countered. The army has forced them from their lands, killed their warriors. Yes, Cholla acknowledged, and still we love, still we connect, because without that, what are we fighting to preserve? Her words hung in the night air, challenging everything Henry had built his life around. He had no answer that didn't sound hollow, even to himself. They sat in silence, watching the fire. Eventually, Cholla spoke again, her voice softer. I lost my father 2 years ago. He was a good man who loved my mother despite the differences in their worlds. After he died, I could have closed myself off. Instead, I chose to honor him by continuing his work, bringing our worlds together where I could. She looked at Henry. That's a choice we all make after loss, to close or to open. Henry met her gaze, feeling something shift within him, and if opening means risking that pain again. It always does, Cholla said. Always. The morning brought clarity and wariness. Something had changed between them during the night's conversation, a connection forming despite Henry's determination to remain isolated. As they broke camp and continued their journey, he found himself watching Cholla with new eyes, noting the grace with which she handled the wagon, the confidence in her posture. They traveled through increasingly rough terrain, climbing into the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. The landscape changed from desert to scattered pine forest, the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. Tell me about your mother's people, Henry said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Surprise flickered across Cholla's face, quickly followed by a smile that transformed her features. They are Chiricahua Apache, led by my uncle after my grandfather died. They've managed to avoid the reservations so far, moving between hidden valleys in these mountains. Won't the army come looking for them? Eventually, Cholla acknowledged. But for now, they've found a balance. My uncle trades with friendly settlers, stays away from the military posts. It won't last forever, but it gives the children time to grow, the old ones time to pass their knowledge. Henry nodded, understanding the precarious nature of their existence. And you, where do you belong in all this? The question seemed to catch Cholla off guard. She was quiet for a moment before answering. Between worlds, she said finally. My father made sure I could read, write, understand the white man's ways. My mother taught me the traditions of her people. I don't fully belong in either world, but I can move between them. Sounds lonely, Henry observed. Cholla gave him a measured look. Says the man who chooses to be alone. The remark hit its mark and Henry fell silent. They continued their journey, the wagon creaking over the rough trail. By mid-afternoon, they reached a vantage point overlooking a hidden valley nestled between two mountains. Smoke from several fires rose in thin columns, marking the location of the Apache camp. We should approach openly, Cholla said. They'll have sentries watching the trail. Sure enough, they had traveled barely 100 yards down the slope when two Apache warriors appeared from the trees, rifles ready. Cholla called out in their language, and after a brief exchange, the warriors lowered their weapons and escorted them to the camp. The encampment consisted of several dome-shaped wickiups arranged in a loose circle. Women paused in their work to watch as Cholla and Henry rode in, children darting between the structures with curious glances. An older man emerged from the largest wickiup, Cholla's uncle, Henry assumed, followed by a woman who could only be Cholla's mother. The resemblance between mother and daughter was striking. Though older, Cholla Hawkins carried herself with the same proud bearing as her daughter. She embraced Cholla warmly, then turned assessing eyes on Henry. This is Henry Everett, Cholla explained in English. He helped me when outlaws attacked my wagon. His employer insisted he escort me the rest of the way. Cholla studied Henry for a long moment. You saved my daughter. Henry shifted uncomfortably. She was doing a fine job saving herself, I just evened the odds. A ghost of a smile touched Cholla's lips. Honest at least, she turned to Cholla. Come, the supplies are needed. We will talk after. The next few hours were spent unloading the wagon and distributing its contents. Henry found himself pressed into service, carrying heavy bundles under the watchful eyes of the Apache men. Though not openly hostile, their reserve was clear. He was an outsider, tolerated only because of Cholla. As evening approached, the community gathered around several fires. Henry sat awkwardly at the edge of one group, acutely aware of his outsider status. Cholla appeared at his side, offering a plate of food. "They're curious about you," she said, nodding toward the watching eyes. "Can't blame them," Henry accepted the plate. "White men haven't exactly been friends to your people." "Some have, my father for one." Henry sampled the unfamiliar food, a stew of rabbit and wild plants that was surprisingly flavorful. "How did they meet, your parents?" Cholla settled beside him. "My father was a surveyor for the railroad. He got separated from his party during an Apache raid, not this band, another one. He was wounded and my mother found him. Instead of killing him, she hid him, nursed him back to health." She smiled at the memory. "He always said he fell in love with her before he even knew her name, just watching her gather herbs for his wounds. And her people accepted him. Not at first. But he learned their ways, their language, proved himself useful." Cholla glanced across the fire to where her mother sat with the tribal elders. Eventually, they lived in both worlds, traveling with the band in summer, returning to his trading post in winter. Henry considered this. "Sounds complicated." "Life is complicated," Cholla replied, "especially when you open yourself to it." The evening deepened, and members of the band began to share stories and songs. Though Henry couldn't understand the words, the rhythm and emotion carried meaning beyond language. He found himself drawn into the community's circle, no longer sitting apart but among them. Later, as the fires burned low and people began to retire for the night, Cholla's uncle approached Henry. Gray-streaked hair framed a face lined with experience, eyes that had seen too much change and loss. "You will stay the night," he said in accented but clear English. "It is too dark to travel." Henry nodded his thanks. "I appreciate your hospitality." The older man studied him. "My niece says you fight well. That you came to her aid when others would have ridden past. Anyone would have done the same." "No," the uncle said firmly, "not anyone, not in these times." He gestured toward a smaller wickiup at the edge of the camp. "You will sleep there. Tomorrow we will talk more." As Henry settled into the simple shelter, his mind whirled with new experiences and sensations. The Apache camp was nothing like he had imagined, not the savage encampment of newspaper stories, but a community of families living in harmony with the harsh landscape. And at the center of this revelation was Cholla, who moved between worlds with a grace he envied. For the first time in years, Henry slept without dreaming of death. Morning brought activity as the camp came to life. Women tended fires and prepared food while men checked weapons and discussed hunting plans. Children darted about, engaged in games that seemed part play, part training for adult responsibilities. Henry emerged from his shelter to find Cholla waiting, a clay cup in her hand. "For you," she said, offering the steaming liquid, "pine needle tea, good for strength." He accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Your people are very organized." "Survival requires it." Cholla sat beside him as he drank. "You slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," Henry admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "The mountains have that effect." She looked up at the towering pines surrounding the camp. "My father said these mountains have their own spirit, a presence that watches over those who respect them." Before Henry could respond, shouts erupted from the edge of the camp. A young warrior raced in, calling out in Apache. Immediately the camp transformed, women gathering children, men reaching for weapons. "What's happening?" Henry asked, rising to his feet. Cholla's face had gone pale. "Soldiers, a patrol is coming up the valley." Henry felt a chill. He knew what soldiers did when they found hostile Apache bands living off the reservation. The Indian Wars had created an atmosphere where military men shot first and asked questions later. "How many?" 12, Jonas says, with a lieutenant leading them. Henry made a quick calculation. The camp held perhaps 20 warriors, but fighting would mean death for everyone. The army would simply send more soldiers, hundreds if necessary. "They need to hide," he said urgently. "Get the women and children into the forest." "The men too." Cholla shook her head. There's not enough time. The soldiers are less than an hour away and there are infants, elders who cannot move quickly. Henry looked around the camp, an idea forming. What if they found something else? Not an Apache camp, but a trading outpost. Understanding dawned in Cholla's eyes. You mean? Change what they can see, Henry confirmed. Hide the wickiups under canvas like traders' tents. The women and children can hide in the forest but leave enough men to look like a trading party. He paused. And I'll be here, a white man would make it more believable. Cholla translated the plan rapidly to her uncle, who listened with narrowed eyes. After a brief consultation with the other elders, he nodded sharply and began issuing orders. The transformation was remarkable. Within half an hour, the distinctly Apache camp had been disguised. Canvas trading cloths covered the wickiups, trade goods were prominently displayed, and Henry positioned himself at the center of the activity, dressed in his cowboy gear with his rifle casually propped nearby. When the soldiers arrived, they found what appeared to be a small trading operation. Henry Everett, frontier trader, with his Apache employees and guides. The lieutenant, a young man with a pinched face and new uniform, was clearly disappointed. We had reports of a hostile band in this area. No hostiles here, Lieutenant, Henry said easily, just doing some business with these fellows. They bring in furs, I trade for supplies they need. He gestured to the carefully arranged goods. Been working these mountains for 2 seasons now. The officer's eyes narrowed with suspicion. And you trust these savages? Henry felt a flash of anger but kept his expression neutral. They're good trackers and know where the game is. Business is business, Lieutenant. What's your name? Henry Everett. I work out of Tucson mostly, but summer's good hunting up here. The lieutenant dismounted and walked around the camp, his men remaining on horseback, rifles ready. Henry felt sweat trickling down his spine despite the cool mountain air. And these Apache, they're peaceful. They're businessmen same as me, Henry said, just trying to make a living. The lieutenant examined the disguised shelters, the trade goods, the carefully neutral expressions of the Apache men who remained in camp. Finally, he turned back to Henry. You should know, Everett, that all Apache are required to be on the reservation at San Carlos. Trading with hostiles is against the law. Henry spread his hands. These men have papers, Lieutenant. Passes to conduct trade. He nodded to Cholla's uncle, who produced carefully preserved documents, legitimate trading passes obtained years earlier. The lieutenant examined them skeptically but couldn't find fault. After a final suspicious look around the camp, he remounted his horse. I'd be careful out here, Everett. These mountains aren't safe for white men. I appreciate the concern, Henry replied. But I've got good men watching my back. Only when the patrol had disappeared down the trail did the camp exhale collectively. Women and children emerged from hiding places in the forest, the canvas coverings were removed from the wickiups, and normal life cautiously resumed. Cholla's uncle approached Henry, his expression solemn. You took a great risk for us today. Henry shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Seemed like the right thing to do. Why? The question was direct, challenging. Why would you risk yourself for Apache people? Henry glanced at Cholla, who stood nearby. Because they're people, because soldiers shooting women and children isn't right, no matter who they are. The older man studied Henry for a long moment, then nodded once. You have a good heart under that white man's skin, he turned to Cholla. Your father would have approved. That evening, the camp celebrated their narrow escape. Despite the lingering tension, everyone knew the soldiers might return. There was music, dancing, and more food than Henry had seen during his entire stay. He found himself drawn into the festivities, taught simple dance steps by laughing children, offered choice pieces of meat by women who had regarded him with suspicion only days before. Cholla watched from beside her mother, a smile playing at her lips. When Henry finally escaped the attention and made his way to her, she handed him a cup of water. You're a hero now, she teased. Brave traitor who fooled the army. Henry drank deeply, embarrassed by the attention. I just said what needed saying. Nayeli, who had been quietly observing, spoke. You risked your freedom for people not your own. This is not a small thing. They're Cholla's people, Henry said simply. That makes them matter to me. The words emerged without thought, honest in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. Cholla's eyes widened and Nayeli looked between them with sudden understanding. "I think perhaps you should walk," she suggested to her daughter. "Show Henry the view from the ridge before the moon sets." Cholla blushed but nodded, leading Henry away from the celebration and along a narrow trail that climbed the nearby slope. They walked in silence, the sounds of the camp fading behind them until only the night insects and their own footsteps remained. The ridge offered a spectacular view of the moonlit valley and the mountains beyond. Henry stood transfixed by the beauty of it, the vastness that somehow didn't feel empty anymore. "I must leave tomorrow," he said finally. "Bernard will be expecting me back." Cholla nodded, her profile silver in the moonlight. "I understand. But I don't want to." The admission cost him, breaking through years of careful distance. Cholla turned to face him. "What are you saying, Henry Everett?" He struggled to find the words to articulate the change that had occurred within him. "I've spent years believing that caring for people was dangerous. That attachment meant inevitable pain." He looked at her directly. "But these past days with you, with your people, I've felt more alive than I have since before the war." "And that frightens you," she observed. "Yes," he admitted. "But not enough to make me run anymore." Cholla moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "What are you asking for?" "Time," Henry said. "Time to know you better. Time to figure out if there's a place for me in your world or you in mine." "Our worlds are very different," Cholla reminded him. "They are," Henry agreed, "but your parents found a way to bridge that gap. Maybe," he hesitated, then plunged ahead, "maybe we could too." In the silver moonlight, Cholla smiled. "Perhaps, but there would be difficulties. My people have seen much cruelty from white men. Your people would not easily accept an Apache wife." Wife, the word hung between them, both startling and right. "I'm not asking for promises," Henry said. "Just possibility." Cholla considered this, then stepped closer. "Possibility requires courage, Henry Everett. The courage to open your heart, even knowing it may be broken." "I think," Henry said slowly, "that's a risk I'm finally willing to take." When he returned to the Diamond B the following day, Henry carried more than memories of his time in the Apache camp. He carried a purpose that had been missing from his life for years. Over the weeks that followed, he threw himself into his work with new energy, impressing even Bernard with his dedication. "Something changed you up in those mountains," Bernard observed one evening as they checked the books in his office. Henry looked up from the ledger. "I met someone, a woman who made me see things differently." Bernard leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile spreading across his weathered face. "Cholla Hawkins." "Yes," Henry admitted, "she's extraordinary." "And Apache." "Half-Apache," Henry corrected automatically, then sighed. "But yes." Bernard studied him for a moment. "You know that won't be an easy road." "I know. But you're considering it anyway." Henry nodded. "I am." Bernard closed the ledger. "Then you'd better make it work. Good women, women who change us for the better, they don't come along every day." 2 weeks later, Henry rode back into the mountains, carrying not only supplies but a letter. He found the Apache camp moved to a new location, higher and more secluded after the close call with the Army patrol. Cholla greeted him with surprise and undisguised pleasure. That evening, after sharing the camp's meal, they walked again to a private spot overlooking the valley. "I have something for you," Henry said, producing the letter, "from Bernard and his wife." Cholla opened it, her eyes widening as she read. "They're offering us land, part of the Diamond B." Henry nodded. "Bernard's getting older. He needs trusted managers for the outer portions of the ranch. He's offering us the north section, good grazing land, water rights, and far enough from town to avoid troublemakers." Us. Cholla looked up from the letter. "If you want it," Henry said carefully, "if you want me." The proposal was awkward, unplanned, but Cholla's smile transformed it into something perfect. "My mother's people need a safe place," she said. "Somewhere they can live without constant fear of soldiers." Henry nodded. "Bernard mentioned that too, said there's enough land for a small settlement if they're discreet. He has friends in the territorial government who could arrange papers." Cholla stared at him. "You would do this, create a home not just for me but for my people?" I would, Henry said, surprised by his own certainty. I've spent too many years running from connection, from belonging. Your people taught me that survival isn't enough, we need community to truly live. Cholla stepped closer, her eyes bright in the fading light. Then yes, Henry Everett. Yes to the land, yes to building something together, and yes to you. Their wedding combined traditions from both worlds. They were legally married by a justice of the peace in Tucson, with Bernard and Mrs. Michaels as witnesses. 2 weeks later, in the shadow of the Chiricahua Mountains, Cholla's uncle performed an Apache blessing ceremony, binding them together in the eyes of her people. Over the next year, they built a home on the north section of the Diamond B. It wasn't a traditional ranch house nor an Apache wickiup, but something in between, solid wooden walls with designs that respected the land and natural airflow to keep it cool in summer and warm in winter. Gradually, members of Cholla's extended family settled nearby, creating a small community that existed just beneath the notice of territorial authorities. Their home became a meeting place between worlds. Apache hunters brought game, Anglo traders stopped for supplies, and Mexican vaqueros shared skills for managing cattle in the harsh terrain. Under Henry and Cholla's guidance, the north section of the Diamond B flourished. Henry never completely lost his wariness. The violent deaths of his family had marked him too deeply for that. But with Cholla beside him, he found the courage to open himself to connection, to build relationships with neighbors and family, to invest in a future he once couldn't imagine. On a warm evening 2 years after their first meeting, Henry sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. Cholla joined him, their infant daughter cradled in her arms. Maria Naeli Everett, named for both Henry's mother and Cholla's, slept peacefully, her features a perfect blend of her parents' heritage. "Any regrets?" Cholla asked, settling beside him. Henry looked at his wife and daughter, then at the community they had built together, Apache families living in peace, cattle grazing on land that supported them all, a future taking shape before his eyes. "Not one," he said, reaching for her hand. "You taught me that walls don't actually protect us, they just keep out the good along with the bad." Cholla smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And you taught me that bridges can be built between worlds, if there's courage enough to try." As darkness fell over the desert, stars appearing in the vast Arizona sky, Henry Everett held his family close. The cowboy who had once believed in isolation had learned the most important lesson of the frontier from his Apache bride, that even in the rugged landscape of the West, love could blossom, healing wounds that had seemed beyond repair and creating a home where none had existed before.